I've spent years exploring the forgotten corners of the Midwest, abandoned factories, schools, and hospitals left to rot. But none of them haunted me quite like Jude's, an abandoned children's psychiatric hospital that closed abruptly in 1989. The official report said budget cuts, but locals whispered about a patient's room that never stayed locked and a child who vanished without a trace. It took months to find a way inside. My team was small. Mark, the skeptical realist, who treated every exploration like a construction inspection, and Sarah, the sensitive one who could sense dread before we even arrived. That night, around 2 a.m., we slipped through a hole in the fence behind the main complex. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of rust and something sterile. The hospital loomed before us, 3 stories of crumbling brick and black, vacant windows. Mark led us through an access tunnel into what used to be the laundry room. Inside, the silence felt unnatural, as if the building itself were listening. The first few rooms were typical broken desks, vandalized walls, but the deeper we went, the more wrong it felt. The patient wing hit differently. Everything was smaller, tiny beds, miniature chairs, faded crayon drawings on peeling walls, stick figures with hollow eyes and crooked smiles. Sarah's voice was barely audible. "It smells like old people and disappointment," she muttered. Even Mark seemed rattled. In one observation room, we found a rocking horse, untouched and perfectly centered under layers of dust. As I took a photo, a sharp scraping sound echoed down the hall. Sarah froze. Mark insisted, "Raccoon." But the sound had been too heavy, like furniture dragging across concrete. The silence that followed was suffocating. We pressed on, entering the isolation wing, where the air grew thick and the temperature dropped. That's when I saw a single fresh footprint in the undisturbed dust. It wasn't old or smudged. It was sharp, recent. A sneaker print. "Someone's been here," I whispered. Mark examined it. "Fresh," he admitted. Sarah's panic rose. "We need to go. There are people here." But I knew this wasn't another explorer. Someone had been watching. We decided to retreat. Near the old administrative offices, I noticed a clock frozen at 3:05. Behind it came a faint hum, like a weak electrical current. I leaned in to listen, and from the rusted intercom speaker above the clock came a garbled, whispering voice. It was faint, static-laced, almost saying a name, then a low, mocking laugh. Before we could react, a metallic slam shattered the silence. The unmistakable clank of a chain and the click of a padlock echoed through the halls. It came from the laundry room, our only exit. Mark's face drained of color. I used a brick to hold the door open." We sprinted back. The service door was now bound by a thick steel chain and a massive padlock, gleaming like a cruel joke. We were trapped. Sarah's breathing quickened. "He's still here. He's listening." I pulled out my phone, no signal. We decided to search for another way out. The windows were reinforced, nailed shut. We had to go up. The second floor was identical to the first, but colder, heavier. By the third, the windows were barred, and the air itself seemed to hum. Mark suddenly froze. "The intercom," he muttered. "If there's power, someone rigged it. If they can talk to us, maybe we can talk back." It was reckless, but we were desperate. We returned to the office with the frozen clock. The hum was stronger now. I leaned toward the intercom and whispered, "Who are you? Let us out." Static. Then a voice, soft, distorted, and childlike. "You were supposed to stay in the light." The words slithered through the static, deliberate and cruel. Mark shouted at the speaker, "This isn't funny. Unlock the door." But the voice ignored him. Instead, it spoke my name wrong. "It's colder in 305, isn't it, Nate? You'll never find the others, Nate." "My name isn't Nate. It's Chris." Sarah's eyes went wide. "I didn't say that name. I swear I didn't." That's when I understood. Whoever was speaking wasn't guessing they knew the building's past. Room 305, the vanished patient's room. The intercom went silent. "We're going there," I said. "If 305 has a window, it might be our only exit." We sprinted up the stairs to the 3rd floor. The isolation wing was darker than before, the air almost solid. We reached room 305. The door gave way with a kick. Inside was nothing but a rusted metal cot and a symbol carved into the plaster, a circle with a tiny figure staring through a keyhole. Then Mark shouted, "The fire escape!" Outside, the grime-coated window was the bottom rung of a rusted ladder, tangled in dead ivy. As we listened, the faint sound of an engine starting drifted from outside the sound of a car driving away. Whoever had trapped us was gone. I swung a rebar into the window until it shattered. Sarah climbed first, reaching for the ladder. It was too far. "I can't," she gasped. Mark steadied her, pressing his back against the wall. She stretched, caught the rung, and pulled herself out. We followed, the ladder groaning as we descended. We ran across the overgrown yard, through the fence, not stopping until we reached my SUV, parked a mile away. Sarah collapsed, sobbing. Mark was pale and trembling. I fumbled for my keys, then froze. Mark was pointing at the passenger window. A Polaroid photo was taped to the glass. It showed the three of us standing in Street Jude's common room, the one with the crayon drawings. The picture had been taken from a high corner, looking down. We hadn't even known anyone else was there. On the bottom of the photo, scratched into the margin, was the same circle and keyhole symbol from room 305. Our stalker hadn't just trapped us. They'd been watching us the entire time. I ripped the Polaroid off the car window. The picture trembled in my hands before fluttering to the gravel. We stood in silence, the night pressing down around us, the realization settling in. Whoever had done this had been close enough to touch us. Mark was shaking uncontrollably. How did they get here? We would have seen headlights. They must have parked somewhere else, I said. They knew our car, our route, everything. I wanted to leave, to drive until sunrise, but as we sped down that cracked country road, the feeling didn't fade. The fear didn't stay behind with the hospital, it followed. Every set of headlights behind us felt like eyes. Every turn in the dark looked like a trap. By the time we hit the interstate, Sarah had stopped crying. Her camera was clutched tight in her lap, the strap twisted around her wrist. "There might be something on here," she whispered. Whoever it was, maybe I caught them in a shot. We didn't stop until morning. A cheap motel, flickering neon, and the faint smell of mold. None of us spoke while we reviewed the photos. The images were ordinary empty corridors, peeling paint, broken furniture. Then, one photo made Sarah gasp. In the reflection of a safety glass window, a figure stood in the background, just a vague silhouette. The proportions looked wrong. Shoulders too narrow, arms too long, head tilted slightly, like someone curious but distant. It wasn't any of us. Mark tried to rationalize it. Motion blur. Maybe one of us moved. "I took that one," Sarah interrupted. "You two were in front of me." The fear returned like a physical thing. The more we looked, the more we saw the faint blur in another shot, always at a distance, always watching, sometimes near the ceiling, as if standing on furniture or a ledge. That night, none of us slept. A week later, I started hearing it again. The hum, that same electric vibration we'd heard from the hospital walls. It followed me into my apartment, faint but constant. I unplugged everything, checked the walls, the vents, nothing stopped it. Then came the static. It started on my baby monitor, an old one I used, for recording audio in the field. Just a faint whisper under the noise, the same way it had begun at Street Jude's. I played it back, amplifying the signal, and there it was again. That same distorted voice. "You were supposed to stay in the light." I slammed my laptop shut and disconnected every device. When I told Mark, he brushed it off. "Residual paranoia," he said. "Psychological echo from trauma." 2 days later, Sarah called him in tears. Someone had broken into her apartment. Nothing was stolen, but on her kitchen table, taped neatly in the center, was a single Polaroid. This one showed her sleeping. We went to the police. They listened, took notes, and promised to look into it. The officer's expression said everything. Another ghost story from stupid thrill seekers. When they left, Mark muttered, "We need to go back." Sarah stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "Back? Are you insane?" He shook his head. "We missed something. Someone set that up. Cameras, speakers, power lines, it was orchestrated. If we go back in daylight, we can find where they ran the intercom line. And this." I wanted to say no, but deep down I needed closure too. The fear was eating us alive. So, 3 days later, we returned to Street Jude's in daylight. The place looked smaller under the sun, less like a monster, more like a ruin. We went straight to the main office, the one with the clock and the speaker. Mark brought a crowbar, convinced the wiring would lead to the truth. The hum was gone. Everything was silent. We pried the speaker loose. Behind it was a tangle of newer wires, spliced into the old system. Someone had recently connected a power source. It wasn't ghostly, it was deliberate. Someone had rebuilt the intercom just to torment anyone who entered. Mark followed the wires along the wall, tracing them down into the subflooring. "There's a battery pack somewhere," he said. "A control box." That's when Sarah called from the hallway. "Guys, you need to see this." We followed her to the isolation wing, where dust blanketed everything except one section of floor. Someone had recently swept it clean. In the center stood a small metal folding chair, and on it, a single tape recorder. The play button was already pressed down. A burst of static filled the air, followed by that same distorted voice, only this time, clearer. "You shouldn't have come back, Nate." Mark kicked the recorder over, shattering it. "This is staged," he shouted, voice trembling. "Someone's been here, maybe living here." We turned to leave, but something glinted under the broken plastic. A small metal key, tagged with a faded label, 305. Sarah's breath hitched. No, we're not doing this." But Mark was already moving toward room 305. He wasn't thinking anymore, just following some terrible logic. When he reached the door, the lock turned easily. It had been oiled recently. Inside, the air was colder. The same cot, the same carved circle and keyhole symbol. But there was something new, a stack of Polaroids laid neatly on the bed. The first was of us, standing outside the hospital gate weeks ago. The second showed us inside, entering the tunnel. The third was from the night we escaped, Mark climbing down the ladder. The final one stopped me cold. It was a photo of us standing in the same room we were in right now, Mark at the door, Sarah by the wall, and me holding the first Polaroid in my hand. Sarah screamed. Mark spun around, searching the corners. "They're here," he yelled. Then came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, somewhere down the hall. We backed up, our lights sweeping wildly. "Back to the stairs," I hissed. But as we turned, a metal door slammed behind us, echoing like a gunshot. The footsteps grew louder. Mark gripped the crowbar like a weapon, standing between us and the hall. "Run when I say," he muttered. But there was nowhere to run, just sealed doors and a shattered window from years past. The sound stopped outside the door. Silence. Then, a soft knock. Once. Twice. Then, the intercom above the doorway crackled to life. "It's colder in 305, isn't it, Nate?" The voice was right above us. I didn't wait. I lunged for the window. The glass had been replaced new, strong, impossible to break by hand. I swung the crowbar with everything I had. Once, twice, 3 times the pain finally gave way, shards exploding outward. "Go!" I shouted. Sarah crawled through first, scraping her arms bloody. Mark followed, but as he did, his crowbar slipped from his grasp and fell back inside. I reached for him, pulling until he collapsed beside me. We stumbled through the brush, sprinting until the hospital disappeared behind the trees. It's been months since then. Sarah left town. She doesn't answer calls anymore. Mark still insists it was a hoax, an elaborate prank by another explorer, but he's changed. He checks the locks twice every night and keeps a crowbar under his bed. As for me, I moved states. Started over. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that faint, electrical hum again. It creeps through the walls like a whisper. Last week, I found something on my doorstep, a package wrapped in brown paper. No return address. Inside was a small, dusty cassette tape and a single Polaroid. The photo showed me sitting at my desk, reading an email. The timestamp was from 2 nights earlier, and written across the bottom, in tiny, uneven letters, was the same symbol from the wall of room 305. A circle, a childlike figure, staring through a keyhole. I used to think that the real horror was found in places that were violently forgotten, like the peeling paint of street Judes. But I learned a different, more insidious kind of terror can be found in places that are perfectly preserved, right in the middle of civilization. Places that simply weren't supposed to exist. This next story took place in a city I'll call Mersin, at the heart of its massive, classical, main branch, the Mersin Central Library. The library was a colossal, stone-faced building, famous for its grand, vaulted reading rooms and its legendary, closed-off archival stacks, which held documents dating back to the city's founding. It was all about controlled access, security, and an almost religious reverence for quiet, perfect challenge. My team this time was just two of us, me and my partner, Alex. Alex was the calm thinker. He was meticulously organized, approaching every exploration like a military operation, mapping potential routes and exits, his adrenaline always kept at a steady, manageable simmer. He was also an architectural historian, and the library was his Everest. We got in through a freight elevator shaft on a Saturday night after the building closed, securing the door with a custom-made rubber wedge. Our goal was the infamous archival stacks. We wanted the pictures no one else had, the first edition books, the forgotten cartography, the sheer, historical quiet. We spent the first hour easily navigating the main floors, everything immaculate, smelling of leather, paper, and old, cold air conditioning. We finally located the door to the stacks, a heavy, fire-rated steel door marked Staff Only, Restricted Access. Alex slipped a thin, pre-cut piece of plastic between the jamb and the frame, and with a quiet click, we were in. The archival stacks were a labyrinth. Floor-to-ceiling metal shelving, rows and rows of knowledge stretching into the dim, fluorescent-lit distance. The lighting here was always on, a dull, sickly yellow hum of perpetual preservation. We were on the 4th floor, the highest public floor, and we figured the most interesting artifacts would be down in the basement archives. As we were heading toward the main service elevator, Alex stopped me, shining his light up at the ceiling. "Wait," he whispered, his voice hushed with professional awe, not fear. "Look at the ceiling height, Chris. We're on the 4th floor. The main reading room below us is maybe 25 feet high, and the roof above is about 15. We should have more vertical space here." I looked up. He was right. The ceiling was low, oppressively low, maybe 8 feet. It made the air feel thick and close. Alex consulted his architectural blueprint, a digitized, watermarked file he'd somehow procured. The plans list the 4th floor ceiling height at 12 feet for the stacks. Where's the missing 4 feet of space? It was a mystery that only an architect would care about, but it immediately drew me in. Missing space in an old building usually meant a maintenance crawl space, a hidden duct system, or the kind of dusty cavity we usually avoided. We started a systematic search of the perimeter walls, and then we found it, tucked into a dusty corner between a rarely used loading dock entrance and a bank of storage lockers. A single, unused doorway. No signage, no handle, no light. Just a seam in the otherwise monolithic concrete wall, flush to the surface, painted the same institutional off-white. Alex ran his hand over the seam. "It's a secret door," he stated, his eyes shining with pure historical curiosity. "A blind door. It's meant to be invisible, but it opens inwards." He pulled a thin, specialized suction cup from his backpack, affixed it to the middle of the door, and with a quiet, careful pull, the slab of concrete and paint shifted a centimeter. A rush of air, cold and stale, wafted out, smelling distinctively of ozone and dust, a completely different smell from the old paper scent of the rest of the library. Behind the door was a narrow, steep staircase leading straight up, not down. The walls of the stairwell were raw, unfinished cinder block, completely unlike the finished plaster and wood of the rest of the library. It was rough, unfinished construction, a deliberate, architectural secret. "This is it," Alex breathed, his adrenaline finally spiking. "The hidden floor. It's not on the public or staff blueprints. It's an undocumented level." We began to ascend. It was completely dark, and our headlamps revealed that the stairs were coated in a fine, powdery layer of undisturbed plaster dust, the kind that settles after construction. We went up about 25 feet, the exact 4 feet of height we suspected, plus the extra height to make up a new, full floor. When we reached the top, we pushed through a final, lightweight maintenance door. The room that opened before us was unnerving. It was a library, but completely wrong. There was no furniture, no vaulted ceiling, no polished wood. It was one massive open room with concrete floors and cinder block walls, divided by more rows of shelving. But these shelves weren't full of books. They were full of reels of tape, thousands of them. Old quarter-inch magnetic tape reels, the kind used for early computer storage or massive audio recordings. They were stacked row after row, floor to ceiling, all in identical beige plastic cases, each one labeled with a small, handwritten white tag. The tags had no titles, no dates, just long, complex sequences of letters and numbers. The room had a low, constant whirring sound too. We traced it to the far end of the room, where a bank of antiquated, enormous server racks were blinking silently, their cooling fans generating the low drone. The entire hidden floor was dedicated to this archaic, massive collection of recorded data. "What is this place?" I whispered, shining my light on a reel. Alex walked over to the bank of servers, his hand hovering over one of the blinking lights. "This isn't data storage, Chris. It's an archive. But not of books. Of sound." He gently touched one of the tape boxes. "Look at the label sequence. It's not an accession number. It's a timestamp. I recognize the formatting. This is a collection of recordings. Chronological. Maybe interviews, maybe surveillance. It's massive." My initial curiosity was beginning to curdle into a distinct uncertainty. Why would the city's central library have a massive, secret, self-contained, fully powered archive of anonymous audio recordings hidden away above the public stacks? Suddenly, the whirring of the server fans seemed to increase in tempo, getting louder. The rhythmic click-click-click of a nearby, unseen mechanism started up. We froze. "What was that?" I mouthed to Alex. He pointed to a small, isolated desk tucked away behind a stack of reels. On it, surrounded by dust, was a fully operational, open-reel tape recorder. The kind a reporter might have used in the 1,970 seconds. The machine was running. The two spools were turning slowly, the tape feeding itself from the supply reel to the take-up reel. The small, red recording light was not on. It was playing back, and from the small metal speaker, a sound emerged. It was distant, tinny, and very, very familiar. It was the sound of my own voice, slightly echoed but unmistakable. "We should have more vertical space here." It was Alex's voice, from less than 10 minutes ago, followed by a slight metallic click. The recording had just stopped. It was a perfect, seamless, almost instant replay of our conversation from the floor below. The system was recording us, and it wasn't passive. The sudden jump in the server fan noise, it was a processing spike, and the playback was a deliberate warning. Someone, somewhere in the library, or with remote access, was monitoring every centimeter of this hidden floor, and they just let us know. "We need to leave," I whispered, turning toward the hidden stairwell, the raw fear of being watched, of being meticulously recorded overwhelming all curiosity. But before we could take a step, the tape recorder on the desk sprang back to life. It didn't start playing the audio from our trip up the stairs. Instead, a completely different recording began. It was the sound of a woman crying, soft, muffled, and desperate. The sound of someone being forcefully silenced. And over the sound of the woman's sobs, a different voice, a man's, came through, clear and sickeningly calm, speaking just 2 words. "Checkmate, Alex." The voice was not tinny. It was not distant. It was recorded with sickening clarity. And it was a voice I felt, in the pit of my stomach, I had heard before. The sound of the man's voice, that clear, calm, final pronouncement, "Checkmate." Alex cut through the silence and the whirring of the servers with a chilling, undeniable certainty. The sound of the woman's despairing sobs, muffled and then abruptly cut off, hung in the air like a physical presence. The terror wasn't just that someone was listening. It was that the person operating this system knew Alex's name, and this hidden floor contained evidence of something truly horrifying. Alex froze, his composure completely gone, his face pale and slick with sudden sweat. He was no longer the calm thinker. He was the targeted victim. That's not possible," he stammered, his eyes glued to the spinning reels on the desk. "I haven't used my full name since I was a kid. Who the hell is that?" I grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the hidden stairwell. "We are done, Alex. This isn't Urbex. This is a crime scene, or a trap. Let's go." We scrambled down the cinderblock staircase, sliding on the dust-covered steps. We wrestled the blind door back into place. It was an imperfect fit, and I could hear the faint, low whirring of the server fans even when it was closed. Back on the 4th floor stacks, the normal library silence felt like a deafening roar. We moved with a frantic urgency that was antithetical to the slow, measured pace of a typical exploration. We reached the restricted access door. And Alex, his hands shaking, slipped the plastic wedge into the jamb to open the lock. Just as the door was about to give, a loud, clear, administrative voice, the kind used for announcements, boomed from the library's official public address system, speakers that were mounted high on the wall, completely separate from the archive's intercom. Attention, Central Library visitors. The building is currently closed. Security will be sweeping the stacks. Anyone found on the premises will be prosecuted. It was a standard announcement, but the timing was perfect. It wasn't a human talking. It was a pre-recorded loop. But the person monitoring us had just manually triggered the system, sending security toward us. Our small window of unnoticed retreat had just slammed shut. "They know our location now," I hissed. "Freight elevator, go!" Andri. We moved through the rows of shelving, our headlamps dancing nervously. We could hear the heavy, rhythmic thud, thud, thud of approaching footsteps coming from the main corridor. They were heavy, disciplined footsteps. Not a lone security guard, but a dedicated team. We reached the freight elevator shaft, where we had left our rubber wedge securing the door. I pulled my light up. The wedge was gone. The heavy steel door was sealed shut. "No, no, no," Alex whimpered, checking the door handle, which was stiff and unyielding. "They must have used the master override. They were waiting for us at the exit points." We were back in a locked room, but this time, the walls were the meticulously preserved stacks of a public institution, and the threat wasn't a ghost, but a group of very real people employed by the city. We had to find another way out of the stacks, and fast. I remembered seeing a small emergency ladder bolted high up onto the steel structure of the stacks, leading to a maintenance catwalk that crossed over the whole fourth floor. It was a risky climb, but our only option. We scrambled up the ladder, our boots scraping the metal, the noise echoing too loudly in the massive hall. Just as we reached the catwalk, the steel door to the stacks burst open. Two figures in black security uniforms, carrying tactical flashlights, stepped in. Their beams were powerful, blinding us instantly. "Hands up, put your lights down," one of them yelled, his voice electronically amplified. We couldn't surrender. If they saw our gear, the custom lockpicking tools, the illegal access, we'd be facing serious prison time. We sprinted across the catwalk, moving toward the far end of the building, toward the main public staircase that led down to the ground floor lobby. The security guards were shouting, moving into the aisles, trying to find a parallel path. We reached a small, locked-off room at the end of the catwalk, a maintenance closet. I picked the cheap latch in seconds, and we tumbled inside, slamming the door shut, locking it behind us. The room was tiny and smelled of ammonia. Alex pressed his ear against the thin door. "They're right outside. They know we're here. We're trapped on the highest level." I looked around the small closet frantically. I saw a thick, bundled electrical cable dropping into the wall, and next to it, a small, heavy, rectangular metal panel with a handle. I pulled it open. It was a vertical drop chute. Not a laundry chute, but a small, decommissioned pneumatic tube system, barely wide enough for a person, that went straight down to the basement loading dock. A terrifying, risky, but potentially instant exit. "I'm going down," I said, not as a question, but as a statement of final intent. "It's faster than running down 4 flights of stairs." "You'll break your legs," Alex argued, his face a mask of terror. "It's a long drop, but the walls are smooth. I can slow myself down. Better than the cops." I took my headlamp off, shoving it into my pocket, and lowered myself into the chute, my elbows and knees bracing against the metal walls. The fall was agonizing, a screech of metal against my clothes, the smell of burnt dust and old lubrication oil filling my nose. I slid, slowed, then dropped again. The darkness absolute. Finally, with a sickening thud that jarred every bone in my body, I hit the bottom. I landed on a pile of what felt like dusty, old carpets. I was in a small, sealed-off room, the base of the pneumatic system. It was the basement of the library, the absolute lowest level. I pushed open a flimsy maintenance door and found myself in the main loading dock area. Silent, empty, and smelling of garbage and old stone. I looked up. The freight elevator door was sealed. The heavy, outside loading dock doors were locked. No way out. Then I heard it again. The library's massive, old PA system hissing to life, the speaker right above my head. The same calm, sickening man's voice that had spoken to Alex on the hidden floor. now spoke clearly into the PA system, sounding as if he was standing right next to the microphone. "We know you're in the sublevel, Alex. The security detail is proceeding to your location. You should have stayed on the 4th floor." The voice wasn't talking to the security guards. It wasn't a general announcement. It was a direct, terrifying final message. And it wasn't addressing me. It was addressing Alex. I pulled my phone out again, desperately trying for a signal. Nothing. I was a floor below ground, surrounded by tons of stone. Suddenly, a massive, heavy clang echoed from the stairwell at the far end of the dock. The security team was in the basement. They were coming for Alex. My heart hammered. I had to get out. I saw a small, rusted maintenance tunnel running from the corner of the loading dock, labeled Storm Drain Access. I didn't hesitate. I kicked the thin metal door open and dove into the cold, concrete tunnel, scrambling on my hands and knees toward the street. As I disappeared into the dark, wet opening, the last thing I heard was the loud, definitive smash of the loading dock door being kicked in, followed by the terrifying, echoing shouts of security guards. I didn't wait for Alex. The fear of being implicated in whatever crime that secret archive contained, whatever that voice represented, was a cold, hard knife to the throat. I crawled through the drain for what felt like an hour, finally emerging, soaking wet and covered in grime, into an empty, downtown alley, a block from the library. I called the police from a payphone and reported a break-in at the library, giving a vague description of men in uniforms. I never mentioned the hidden floor, the tape recordings, or the names. I couldn't risk it. I never heard from Alex again. I called his phone repeatedly for a week. It went straight to voicemail. I drove past the library countless times. Everything looked normal, pristine, and perfectly quiet. The news was silent. The hidden floor was silent. The voice that knew his name had vanished back into the static. I am left with the chilling, persistent fear that Alex is still somewhere inside that massive, silent building, a perfectly preserved data point in the library's secret, ongoing collection, an archive of human panic and despair, labeled with a complex sequence of letters and numbers, forever filed away in the terrifying silence of the hidden floor. After the library, I took a break, a long one. The idea of confined spaces and unknown watchers was an open wound in my mind. When I decided to ease back into urban exploration, I chose places that were outside, open, and utterly desolate, the kind of place where, if you heard a sound, you could see exactly what made it. This led me to the Pine Ridge Nursery, a massive, defunct agricultural complex about 50 miles from the nearest town. It was a horticultural operation that went bust about 15 years ago. The central structure was a huge, 2-story administrative building, flanked by dozens of colossal, empty greenhouses, long, skeletal tunnels of steel and shattered glass. It was beautiful, in a ruined, end-of-the-world kind of way. I went there alone. I wanted the complete isolation, the quiet that only the truly rural dead zones can offer. I arrived just after sunset, parking my car down a long, overgrown access road. The main administrative building was uninteresting, standard decay, dusty desks, and scattered paperwork. I didn't spend much time there. My real curiosity was drawn to the greenhouses. They were immense, each one stretching out for nearly a quarter mile. The air inside them was thick, humid, and smelled like compost, and wrought a heavy, earthy aroma that was overpowering even 15 years later. I was walking through the third greenhouse, the one with the most shattered glass, when I found the first anomaly. The floor was a mix of cracked concrete and loose, overgrown earth. Most of it was covered in dead, dry weeds. But as I passed an empty row of rusted-out planting benches, my light hit a patch of freshly turned soil. Not just disturbed soil, it was a small, neat bed, about 4 feet by 4 feet, the earth rich, dark, and still faintly damp. The tools were lying right next to it, a small, clean, silver trowel, and a new-looking bag of commercial fertilizer, its plastic crisp, unlike the sun-bleached ruin of everything else. I felt that familiar cold spike of uncertainty. Someone was using this abandoned nursery, not just a vagrant looking for shelter, a gardener, a dedicated, active gardener. I took a picture, the flashlight beam illuminating the tiny plot. I quickly walked the rest of the greenhouse, but found nothing else. I backed out and moved to the next building, the fourth greenhouse, which was largely intact. The glass, surprisingly whole. The interior atmosphere, a swampy, tropical-level humidity. It was here that the psychological horror began to truly settle in. The entire floor of this greenhouse, easily 1,000 feet long, was covered in living plants, not weeds. These were organized, lush, and aggressively healthy rows of various non-native plants, tropical ferns, climbing ivy, and enormous, dark green shrubs I didn't recognize. The growth was so thick in some spots that it created an internal labyrinth, a solid wall of pulsing green life in the middle of a skeletal ruin. And amidst the dense vegetation, I saw more evidence of activity. A hose reel with a fresh, bright yellow industrial hose attached to a functioning, dripping spigot. An industrial-sized fan was whirring in the distance, silently pushing the thick air. The electrical system, against all odds, was functional. Someone was maintaining a massive, illegal, and extremely secretive indoor farm in the middle of nowhere. I moved slowly, deep into the green heart of the greenhouse, feeling the heavy, wet leaves brushing against my face. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering. Whatever they were growing, it required a massive investment of time and energy. As I rounded a particularly thick cluster of dark, broad-leafed plants, I stopped dead. In a small, open clearing, illuminated by my light, was a folding table covered in tools. A small gas generator sat humming quietly in the corner, running the fan and the lights that kept this ecosystem alive. But it was the table that commanded my attention. It was a meticulous, professional setup, not for plants, but for something else. There were surgical-grade scalpels, a glass beaker full of clear liquid, and small labeled vials. It looked like a very complex lab for extracting, synthesizing, or perhaps creating some kind of illicit substance. The whole setup was disturbing, but it was just a few feet away from a discovery that made my stomach clench with a cold, primal fear. Standing next to the table, half hidden by a giant 6-foot-tall fern, was a dress form. It was a tailor's mannequin, the kind used to fit clothing. It was made of thick, gray canvas, pinned at the waist, but it wasn't dressed in clothing. It was covered, from top to bottom, in the thick, climbing ivy and dark green leaves of the surrounding plants. The gardener had meticulously woven the vines around the canvas, securing them with thin wire, until the dress form was completely covered, standing like a living, green statue. The plant life was flourishing on it, alive and healthy. I shined my light closer. The canvas body was stiff and bulky, not from padding, but from something hard and rounded inside. I hesitated, my hand shaking, before I reached out and gently nudged the large, bulky shoulder of the form. The whole thing tilted slightly, and a single, small object fell out of the neck hole and onto the damp earth with a soft thud. It was a button, a simple, plastic white button, the kind used on a man's shirt cuff. My breath caught in my throat. I suddenly realized why the canvas form was so rigid, so bulky. It wasn't padding or wire. The gardener hadn't been growing plants on the dress form. They were growing them around what was inside the dress form, something that had once worn a shirt with a white button. Before I could process the sickening implication, the psychological horror of someone turning a human body into a fertilizer, a living trellis for their secret garden, the small gas generator in the corner sputtered, coughed, and died with a final, echoing clunk. The enormous greenhouse was plunged into absolute, oppressive darkness. The fan stopped. The only sound was the heavy, quick drumming of my own heart, and the soft, constant drip, drip, drip of condensation from the ceiling glass onto the wet leaves. And then, from somewhere, deep in the green maze, a sound that was absolutely not a drop of water, not a falling piece of glass, and not the wind. A soft, almost imperceptible snip-snip. The quiet, rhythmic sound of heavy-duty guarded shears closing, and it was coming closer. I wasn't just observing a crime scene. I was trapped inside the perp's perfect, living labyrinth, with someone who was methodical, quiet, and who clearly understood the process of decay and cultivation. I had become the new anomaly in the garden. The absolute darkness was terrifying, far worse than the dim light, because it had come with the distinct, unnerving sound of the shears. The metallic snip-snip was close, too close, and amplified by the dense, humid air of the massive greenhouse. I froze, holding my breath, straining my ears to pinpoint the sound's origin. The sheer mass of the plant life, the privacy they offered to the gardener, was now my greatest enemy. They were a perfect screen for someone moving silently in the dark. Snip, snip. It sounded like it was less than 20 feet away, moving methodically, deliberately. Not like someone searching, but like someone tending to a known path. I slowly, meticulously, reached for the large, heavy-duty flashlight clipped to my belt. I decided against the powerful beam it would make me an instant target. Instead, I activated the small, red-filtered emergency light on the side of my headlamp, casting just enough light to see my feet and the dense green wall in front of me. I moved with painstaking slowness, turning away from the dress form and the sinister table, trying to retrace my steps back toward the entrance of the greenhouse. Every brush of a leaf against my jacket sounded like a gunshot. Snip, snip. Closer. And then I heard a new sound, a soft schlick of a boot pulling free from the wet, muddy earth. I stopped. I couldn't see a thing through the solid wall of dark leaves and vines. I needed a distraction. I fumbled with my backpack, found a small, heavy piece of equipment, an old, heavy-duty battery pack, and threw it. Not toward the gardener, but in the opposite direction, toward a distant steel support beam. The resulting clang and scattering sound of small pieces of metal was deafening in the silence. I didn't wait. As the sound faded, I dashed forward, ducking under a row of thick, leafy vines. I sprinted for maybe 10 seconds before diving behind a massive, chest-high potted shrub, a kind of temporary hiding spot used by the gardener. Silence. The snip-snip stopped. I could feel my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. My breath was shallow, ragged. I pressed myself against the warm plastic pot, praying the dark leaves would conceal me. After what felt like an eternity, the snip-snip started up again. But this time, it wasn't a slow, methodical trim. It was a rapid, furious snip-snip SNIPS, NIPS, NIP, coupled with the tearing sound of leaves and branches being forcefully ripped apart. The sound was coming from the area where I had thrown the battery pack. He was cutting his way through the plants, creating a path directly to where he thought I was. The gardener was completely focused, not on trapping me, but on eliminating the threat to his careful, secret world. I realized with terrifying clarity that the plants weren't just a cover, they were a deliberate, living maze, and the gardener knew the precise, fastest route through it. The way he was cutting, he was probably 50 feet past me and closing fast. I stood up silently, my eyes scanning the ceiling. The only way out was to get back to the entrance, but I couldn't risk the main path. I saw a thin, rusted metal ladder bolted to one of the main steel support beams leading up toward the ridge vent that ran the length of the ceiling. It was high, maybe 30 feet up, but it offered a path over the canopy. I moved to the ladder and began to climb, moving as silently as a cat, pulling myself up on the rusted rungs, ignoring the flakes of rust that dusted my face and hands. I was about halfway up when the cutting abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, complete. He had realized I wasn't there. Then, from directly below me, from the dense green life, a man's voice, quiet and perfectly calm, sliced through the air. It wasn't a yell. It was a conversational tone, chilling in its lack of emotion. "You're climbing, aren't you? That's not smart. The metal is old, and it's a long drop to the floor, where the roots are thickest." I froze, clinging to the ladder. He knew exactly where I was. He was standing directly beneath me, looking up, but he couldn't see me clearly in the dark. "This is my sanctuary," the voice continued, soft and measured. "You shouldn't disturb a man's work. The specimen is finally acclimating. All that hard work, gone to waste because of a camera." My adrenaline spiked, pushing me past fear into pure, desperate action. I scrambled up the last 10 feet, reaching the narrow maintenance walkway just beneath the ridge vent. I pulled myself onto the walkway. Below me, I saw a flicker of light, a small, focused beam from a tiny keychain flashlight aimed straight up. I saw a man, silhouetted against the dark green backdrop of the plants. He was wearing dark overalls, a wide-brimmed hat, and he had a long, wicked-looking pair of shears dangling from his belt. He knew he couldn't climb after me. I was too far ahead, and the climb would make too much noise. So he chose the psychological route, the path of terrifying certainty. He didn't move. He simply raised his shears, held them up to the tiny light, and with a terrible finality, he let them fall open and closed. A sharp, echoing snip that sounded like the severing of a thick rope. "I won't chase you out," he whispered, his voice resonating through the greenhouse. "But you won't come back, because I'll be watching, and you're not as hard to hide as you think." I didn't look down again. I sprinted across the metal walkway, the structure swaying precariously beneath my weight. My only goal to reach the end of the greenhouse, and the small, rusted-out maintenance door I'd seen earlier. I reached the door, kicked the rotting wood, and it burst outward. I scrambled outside, collapsing onto the overgrown concrete path. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I ran, blindly, through the complex, past the other dark, skeletal greenhouses, past the administrative building, not stopping until I reached the overgrown access road where I'd left my car. I fumbled with my keys, threw my gear into the passenger seat, and cranked the engine. I sped down the road, gravel spitting out from under my tires, my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. When I was about a mile away, out on the main, deserted highway, I slowed down and took a single, shaky breath. I was safe. I was out. But as I reached over to pull the zipper on my jacket, my hand brushed against something strange on my shoulder. I pulled it off and held it up to the dim glow of the dashboard light. It was a small, thin, green piece of twine, the kind used for tying delicate plants to a trellis. And attached to the twine was a single, fresh, perfectly trimmed leaf, the enormous, dark green, broad-leafed variety from the plants I didn't recognize. He hadn't just been standing below me on the ladder. He had been close enough to reach out, tie the twine to my jacket, and leave a calling card. He let me escape, not out of mercy, but to ensure that the persistent fear, the psychological certainty of his presence, would follow me home. I yanked the piece of twine and the leaf out of the car window and stomped on the gas, fleeing the scene and the terrifying knowledge that I had met a human being whose true horror was not violence, but the meticulous, patient cultivation of life around the dead. I never went back to Pine Ridge Nursery, but sometimes, when I'm gardening in my own backyard, I stop and listen for the sound of garden shears. And I always check the knots in my shoelaces before I leave the house, just to be sure I haven't been tagged for the next season's growth.